everybody, I'm Natasha Kirchuk, and thanks for joining us for ILTV's weekly program, One-on-One with Alan Dershowitz. We want to give you, our viewers, a chance to have your questions answered by Professor Dershowitz, one of America's greatest legal minds. He's a leading expert on criminal and constitutional law, civil liberties, and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Hi, Professor Dershowitz. So great to see you again.
Likewise.
So we have a lot to talk about today. A lot of things have been happening in the news, especially last night's debate. But let's get started with a different topic. Professor, as you know, every week we open our show with a special guest. Today we're honored to have the Deputy Minister of Regional Cooperation, Ayub Kara, from the Likud party. Let's hear what he has to ask.
Hello, Ellen. It's Ayub Kara, Deputy Minister in the government of Israel. I'm from the Druze nation. I serve the army of Israel. I was part from the military to defend Israel, and now I am in important position in the government of Israel. Why the world is speaking against all the time Israel, attacks Israel, that is apartheid states? It's the wrong process, because in the Middle East you couldn't find in any state there are a lot of committees, Jewish, in all the states, and no one in like my position. So what is the case? Why they are not recognized that Israel is the important democracy, not only in the Middle East, in all the world?
Well, thank you so much, Minister Kara. I have spent such wonderful time with Druze people in some of the Druze villages up near Haifa. I remember spending a weekend there once and being treated just wonderfully. I think that Israel is so fortunate to have a significant and very, very patriotic Druze population, and I hope that over time we'll see more and more members of the Druze community being in the Israeli judiciary and the Knesset in positions of authority and in business and in universities. Look, I fought against apartheid. I was banned by the apartheid regime in South Africa. I edited one of the first articles ever written in the early 1960s about the structure of apartheid. I was honored to work along with Erwin Cutler on the possible release of Nelson Mandela, who was a victim of apartheid. Israel is exactly the opposite of any apartheid country. It welcomes diversity. It has Arab members of the judiciary, including the Supreme Court. I remember sitting at a concert in Jerusalem next to, I think he was the Minister of Culture, who was an Israeli Arab, listening to a concert conducted by Barenboim, which included Arab musicians and Israeli musicians playing together. None of this could have happened in any apartheid regime. There is apartheid in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia has a gender apartheid country. In many countries, there is religious apartheid. Christians are discriminated against, sometimes murdered. But to use the term apartheid against Israel is to insult every victim of real apartheid, certainly the real victims of apartheid in South Africa. And that's why many of the most prominent black leaders of the anti-apartheid movement have been appalled at the misuse of the term apartheid directed against Israel. It is a blood libel, it is wrong, and it must be fought against. Black Lives Matter, the organization in the United States, in its platform, accuses Israel of apartheid as well as genocide. Shame on them for not understanding the truth about Israel. Let them come to Israel and see that there's no country in the Middle East and few countries in the world that are more heterogeneous in terms of religion, ethnicity, race, language, you name it. And so I think Israel ought to continue to work toward complete equality of every one of its citizens. But in the meantime, let's not throw around the term apartheid, because it demeans the real victims of real apartheid.
Thanks for your response, Professor. Now, I myself want to ask you a question about a different minority population living here in Israel. Yesterday marked a special day for the country because another 63 Ethiopian Falashmura Jews finally made it to Israel after fighting to immigrate for years. There are still 9,000 Falashmura Jews living in Ethiopia, but many of them are unable to immigrate to Israel because there isn't enough of a budget to help support their absorption. So, in your opinion, what is Israel's moral obligation to this community? Should there be more being done to help absorb Jewish communities from less developed nations that are experiencing similar instability to Ethiopia?
Well, I was at the airport during one of the earliest flights of Ethiopian Jews to Tel Aviv, and I remember just the joy that they experienced kissing the ground in Israel, and I experienced hugging them and going with them to their village. It's one of the great virtues of Israel that it absorbs Jews from all over the world, and it has to take in every single one. Every single one. There is no excuse for 9,000 of them being left there. Budgetary considerations should not matter. Israel is a wealthy country now. It is a high-tech country. It can and should absorb every single member of the Falashmura group and not question their Judaism. They want to live their lives as Jews. The issue of who is a Jew is not a religious issue. It is not a rabbinical issue. It is a political issue. And under the law of return, the definition of a Jew is broad, and it should be broadened to include all of the Falashmura and any other groups anywhere in the world who reasonably, honestly, and legitimately want to partake in the great experiment of a nation state for the Jewish people. And if there are budgetary considerations, let them pay and let them ask for contributions from around the world. I would be happy to contribute. If we were each asked to adopt one member of the Falashmura, I hereby volunteer immediately to support one or more people. Look, we were strangers in people's land. We needed to be helped. If only Israel was available during the Shoah, think of how many Jews could have been saved. I'm not making any comparisons. I am saying that Israel was established as a country of Aliyah, as a country of welcoming people, and we should not be allowing budgetary or rabbinical or other excuses to be used to not welcome people from every background and every ethnicity into Israel who want to live a Jewish life in the nation state of the Jewish people.
Thanks, Professor. I think this speaks, to the large issue of how Israel should treat Jewish communities around the world, no matter where they're coming from. Now, let's turn to our viewers' questions. Joy is from Argentina, and she has a very unique question about one of the darkest cases in the history of the Jewish Argentine community. In 1994, the AMIA Jewish Community Center was bombed, and it was suspected that the Iranian regime was behind the terror attack, yet the Argentinian government failed to ever convict somebody for the crime. A Jewish Argentinian lawyer named Alberto Nisban suspected that Argentinian leaders did not want to risk their economic ties with Iran and collaborated in covering up the country's role in the attack. His investigation was later cut off after he was found dead in his apartment, a bullet to his head, just a day before he was supposed to testify. Let's hear what Joy has to ask about this case.
My name is Joy, and I'm from Argentina. Professor Dershowitz, my question for you is, should Israel be playing a larger role in uncovering who's behind the bombing of the AMIA Jewish Community Center in Buenos Aires? And who's responsible for the death of prosecutor Alberto Nisman, the lawyer who was fighting to get to the truth? I personally almost lost all hope in seeking justice for this case, but do you think there's something we can do?
Well, thank you so much for your great question. Yes, there is something we can do, and yes, Israel should play a role in conducting an investigation. I have a specific suggestion. Israel ought to retain Luis Ocampo, who was the former chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, also a former Argentine prosecutor who was deeply involved in the investigation and prosecution of the despicable fascist colonels who killed so many Argentines during the disappeared period, many of them Jewish, and many of them non-Jewish. So I do think that the death of Nisman is very suspicious. I think there's absolutely no doubt that there are Iranian fingerprints on the murders of so many Jews and non-Jews in Argentina during the period of time when both the embassy and the Jewish Center were attacked. And so I think it would be great for the Israeli government to retain somebody like Luis Ocampo. I would be happy to help out in the investigation myself, put together a team of lawyers, distinguished independent lawyers. Let's get to the truth. Let's find out what happened. As a great American president, John Adams, once said, facts are stubborn things. Let's get the facts and let the chips fall where they may. We shouldn't allow diplomatic concerns to prevent the truth from coming out. This was an attack on the Jewish community, and this was an attack on Jewish venues, and Jewish people died. It was an attack against Israel, against the nation state of the Jewish people, and I think Israel has a stake in uncovering the truth, and the truth will be very, very painful for Argentina.
And for that matter, it was also the largest terror attack in the history of Argentina. So, you know, it's not only affecting the Jewish community. Thanks, Professor. Let's turn to the U.S. The country is preoccupied with the presidential elections, especially with the second presidential debate. And so is Esti Galili from California.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. Thank you for having me on your show. My name is Esti. I'm from Long Beach, California. I watched the presidential debates last night, and I was a bit disappointed to see that we have veered so far off from what actually matters. I felt as though I was watching two students quarrel in the school playground, as opposed to two presidential candidates. I'm curious to know who you believe won, and what you think we can do to re-engage students, such as myself, to get back on track.
Well, thank you, Esti. It's a great question. I agree with you. I thought both debates were mediocre in terms of informing the voting public as to the differences between the two candidates on the issues. We obviously got a good picture of the difference of the two candidates in terms of temperament and their willingness to use words and names that are negative in character. But I think we learned very little about the policies. We learned a little bit about the difference in healthcare policy. That was important, but not much else. As to the debate, look, I'm a supporter of Hillary Clinton. I've known her for years, so my views may be skewed. But I think Hillary Clinton had two goals last night. One obvious, she wanted to at least win or tie, not lose the debate. But I think also she didn't want to win overwhelmingly and throw a knockout punch so as to get Trump out of the race. I think she understands that she has a much better chance of beating Trump than somebody who might take over if Trump were dumped by the Republican Party, even at the last minute. So I think she had two goals. One, to come out of it looking presidential, and I think she succeeded in doing that. I don't think her answers were perfect. And I think she still has to answer the question about the destroyed emails after receiving a subpoena. But I think he came off something like a third world tyrant, saying he was going to throw her in jail if he won the election. You know, that's what the Iranians do. That's what Putin does. That's what happens in third world countries. In countries like the United States and Israel, you don't throw your political opponents in jail. Tragically, in Israel, there have been convictions of political leaders, but they hopefully haven't been politically motivated. It hasn't been victor's justice. In fact, I think that Hillary might have pointed out that it would not be proper even for a president to require his attorney general to appoint the special prosecutor. In our country and in yours, prosecution is supposed to be independent of the political system. The president should have no role in deciding who is prosecuted, just like the Prime Minister of Israel should have no role in deciding who is prosecuted. The need for an independent prosecutor and independent judiciary is very important, but Donald Trump doesn't seem to understand that. And he says that if he wins, he'll secure victor's justice by throwing Hillary Clinton in jail. That's not the country that I love, and that's not the rule of law, and that's not the way in which politics ought to interact with the legal system.
Yeah, it was scary to hear him say that. Now, thank you, Professor. Turning to Europe, Adam Cohen is from Sweden, and he wants your take on the growing anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment in both his home country and Europe.
Hi, Professor Dershowitz. My name is Adam. I'm from Sweden originally, but I live in Israel for a couple of years. I wanted to ask you about the controversy around the Swedish Foreign Minister Margot Wallström, who made some controversial statements about Israeli extrajudicial killings and has in recent months tried to repair relations between herself and the Israeli government. However, I'm wondering if you think that such attempts are credible given the Swedish left's and her as well, her failure to distance themselves from other anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli statements made by leading politicians, and the growing alliance between the left and what unfortunately is a rather anti-Semitic Muslim activist community that's growing in Sweden. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that credibility of the attempt to repair relations between Sweden and Israel.
Adam, thank you very much for a good question. First of all, on the absolutely ignorant statement made by this Swedish foreign minister about extrajudicial killings, all killings during wartime are extrajudicial. It's just an ignorant statement to talk about the killing of terrorist leaders as an extrajudicial killing. In the debate last night, Hillary Clinton specifically said the United States ought to target and kill the leaders of ISIS. Those are all extrajudicial killings. And you don't have trials to kill people who are combatants. Under international law, it is perfectly appropriate to kill combatants, as long as a person is a combatant, and that has clear definition under international law. They are subject to being killed during wartime. So let's stop this nonsense about extrajudicial killings, as if there's ever such a thing as a judicial killing during the war. Can you imagine what would happen if every time you wanted to kill a soldier, you had to have an indictment and a trial? It just shows such incredible ignorance that you have to worry what the motive is. And I worry very much about the motive of the foreign minister of Sweden. She has shown a hostility and a hatred toward Israel over many years. And it's part, I think, of a Swedish tolerance of terrorism, of Hamas, of other terrorist groups, and a disdain for the only democracy in the Middle East. Shame on Sweden. Sweden used to be a country that sent many of its young people to Israel to kibbutzim, but now the hard left in Sweden, combined with the Islamic right, has combined to make it very difficult in Sweden. In Malmö, Sweden, there were a journalist who walked down the street with a kippah, and he was made to feel very, very uncomfortable and threatened. It's a very unsafe place now for many Jews, and Sweden has a problem, and it has to deal with that problem. It's a European-wide problem. I just saw in today's paper that a restaurant in Munich that had been open for years and had featured Israeli food, even though it wasn't owned by an Israeli, has been forced to shut now, because in Munich, the rise of anti-Semitism, often disguised as anti-Zionism, has made it impossible for people to live openly as Jews who support Israel. So Europe has a major problem, and that explains why we're seeing increased aliyah from some parts of Europe to Israel. But I think the problem is Europe's problem, and Europe has to deal with it. Look, we had a 70-year moratorium in anti-Semitism in Europe after the end of the Shoah, and that moratorium seems to be ending now. And anti-Semitism overtly is acceptable now in many parts of Europe, not from the government point of view, except in places like perhaps Hungary and Poland and Lithuania. But we're seeing it from the bottom up, and we're seeing it on the left. We're seeing it from the European left parties, especially the British Labour Party, which has tolerated anti-Semitism. So I think Europe has a problem, and Europe suffers when it is anti-Semitic. It suffered in the 30s, and it suffers again now from anti-Semitism. So Europe has to turn to itself and ask itself how to deal with this problem of growing anti-Semitism, often disguised as anti-Zionism.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. We had a very international show, topics from around the world. I want to thank all of our guests, especially Deputy Minister Ayub Kara and, of course, Professor Dershowitz. If you'd like Professor Dershowitz to answer your questions, go to iltv.tv or our Facebook page and submit them. We'll see you again next week. Bye, Alan.
Bye.